And
Yeah.
Evan, I'd ask you to stay on video just so people see what's going on. And I guess, Tom, you can go ahead and open it up. Welcome, everyone. We're going to let people have a couple of minutes to join us and get in, but we'll get started with our program pretty close to 7 o'clock. Again, welcome everyone. We've opened up the webinar, and we'll give everybody another minute or two to join us, and then we'll get started probably about 2 minutes after 7. Welcome, everyone. We'll give everyone just about 1 more minute to join us, and then we'll get started. Good evening. I'm Michael Jones. I'm Vice Chair of the West Virginia Center on Climate Change. Welcome you to the second of our third webinar, our summer series on putting together the pieces for a fair transition and leaving no one behind. I'd like to thank everybody for re-signing up and for indulging us for our technical problems from last month, but we're glad to be here with you tonight. Tonight, we will be doing a state policy perspective on just transitions. This program is co-sponsored by the West Virginia Center on Climate Change, the West Virginia College of Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, and the West Virginia Climate Alliance. Tonight, we're honored to have as our featured speaker, State Senator Chris Hansen from the state of Colorado, who will be talking about the Colorado Just Transition Program. And also we will have 2 panelists, Evan Hansen, who's a delegate in West Virginia in the House of Delegates, and Professor Ann Eisenberg, who is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina. What we do is the same as before. We will have Senator Hansen make a presentation, which should go about 18 to 20 minutes. At that time, I will more formally introduce our 2 panelists and ask them to ask some initial questions. In the meantime, this is something that we wish to have our participants to the webinar participate. We do have a question and answer box. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in there. I, as moderator, will also ask that to our speaker, Senator Hansen, and to our panelists. Raising hands, unfortunately, does not do anything in this kind of format because we don't have a way to chat with us. But if there are any questions, please put them in the question and answer block. I'm going to ask our panelists, after we finish that, we'll have the question answer period, and we should be done about 8 o'clock. I'm going to ask our two panelists to mute their cameras, and I'm going to introduce Senator Chris Hansen. He represents District 31 in the Colorado State Senate, where he chairs the Appropriations Committee. He has 20 years of experience in the renewable and electrical companies. He's co-founder and director of programming at the Colorado Energy and Water Institute, a group that brings together policy, industry, nonprofit, and academic leaders to discuss the very important energy-water nexus. Colorado is a coal state like West Virginia. He will discuss with us the Colorado Office of Just Transition and the Just Transition Action Plan that came about as legislation that he was very involved with when he was in their house. So please welcome Senator Hansen, and thank you for your presentation, sir.
All right. Well, wonderful to be with everyone this evening. A very warm welcome from Denver, where we are blanketed in smoke today from the western wildfires, and it hit about 95 degrees. So it's been kind of a full, tough summer in Colorado with all of the impacts from climate change hitting us, particularly in the form of the wildfire smoke. Fortunately, not a bunch of big fires in Colorado, so we're at least thankful for that. But I'm very pleased to be with you tonight to talk a little bit about just transition and how we are handling the retirement of coal-fired power stations in Colorado, and of course, some of the impact that has on the upstream coal mining sector that and sometimes sits right next to those power plants. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time tonight talking about that policy movement that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years, and then very much look forward to the questions from my co-panelists, Ann and Evan, and the discussion that we have tonight. So let me start with just a few of kind of the themes that we found as we work through legislation here. Just make sure this is sharing properly. Make sure everybody can see my screen. And I'll count on you, Michael, to let me know if that's not coming through, but it looks like it's working. So let's dive into a little bit of history.
It is good, Senator.
Great, thank you, Michael. Let's start with a little bit of history here, which is where have we been as a country when it comes to the market share of different types of power resources. And you can see on this chart kind of the change over time. Coal has been a big part of our mix for a long time. And a snapshot to 2020 on the far side of the graph gives you a sense of how quickly renewables are growing at the top of the graph. Nuclear gaining kind of steady market share. And you can see at the bottom of the graph a really rapid reduction in the amount of coal-fired power around the country. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One reason is that there are a lot of cheaper alternatives to coal and in the marketplace right now. So I'm sure most folks are familiar with how rapidly wind and solar prices have come down. This is a chart that many of you may be familiar with from Lazard, an investment advisory group based in New York. And they do tons of work on power transactions around the United States. And this chart is essentially a reflection of what is the market willing to pay for these different resources. And so this is not a chart, based on any subsidies, either positive or negative subsidies. This is a chart really that's just a mark to market. What is the market willing to bear for each of these wind, solar, gas, coal, et cetera. And you can see how wind and solar have very rapidly fallen in price over the last 15 years, 10 years, and how that compares to coal. And the long story short is in Colorado, we have marginal coal prices of about $35 per megawatt hour. and in solar and wind contracts that have recently been signed in Colorado, we're looking at prices that are less than $20. So wind contracts coming in at $18 or $19 a megawatt hour, solar projects with storage coming in at about $25 a megawatt hour. So that makes it very difficult for coal to compete in the marketplace. And of course, that's without any carbon price. That's just the marginal cost of electricity after all the market factors are taken into account. So in Colorado, here's a little snapshot from last year. We're about a third coal, a third natural gas right now. And that red portion of the pie is going to shrink very rapidly because of a set of legislation that we passed since 2019. One of the things that's driving this, of course, is the overall desire to rapidly decarbonize the Colorado economy. In 2019, we passed targets that set us on a course for very rapid change. In 2025, we've have a statutory requirement that we at least get to the Paris Accord target. So you're seeing that it's about 26% decrease from 2015 down to the 2025 target. We're on track to meet that. We've got some work to do, but it looks like we'll get there. By 2030, we've set a statutory target of 50% reduction across the economy. And then by 2050, a 90% reduction. And my guess is that we're going to have legislation that basically is going to push us to 100% decarbonization by 2040 or 2045. So this is where we are in current law, but I think you'll see additional political pressure to increase the rapidity of those targets, but this is where we're shooting for right now. What does that mean sector by sector in Colorado? Some overlap, I'm guessing, with the situation in West Virginia. Transportation, now about 22%. Electric power, as of 2019, is about 23%. And then you can see the rest of the graph on the left-hand side here for the total emissions from the state pre-COVID of 138 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And this is our challenge, just like every other state. How do we get rid of those emissions as rapidly as we can and have the least amount of impact on workers, on families, on towns, and also the least amount of impact possible on ratepayers? So a lot of different considerations as we think about this and how the politics play out in Colorado, probably not dissimilar from some of the considerations in West Virginia. That said, you know, that we do, obviously, we're a blue state, and so the ability to move climate change policy, of course, much wider aperture in Colorado than the current situation in West Virginia. But the good news about what I'm going to talk about is that it's really not a partisan type of situation. And that's what I wanted to really focus on today, and where I think there's an opportunity for West Virginia. So across 43 states, we've got about 105 gigawatts that's going to shut down between now and 2025. And I actually think it's probably going to be more than that by 2025. It's going to be more rapid, I think, than this estimate. And coal plant closures are going to accelerate because of the market conditions that I mentioned and because of climate change policy. And obviously the national elections in 2020 are going to have a big influence on that. We can see it in the transportation package that passed the Senate today. Much more emphasis on climate change, of course, than the previous administration. And the challenge for Colorado is, how do we plan for this eventuality? How do we, in a sense, skate to the puck, to use a sports metaphor, and make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind, the Colorado workers and communities that are affected by plant closure? So we started with House Bill 1913-14, the Just Transition Office. You can see here the office is really focused on Colorado coal mines as well as coal power stations. Here's a list of all the mines in Colorado. You can get a sense of how big they are in production, and that may help folks kind of compare it to the situation in West Virginia, but a huge number of employees across these different mines. Now, that said, Colorado has a population of about 6 million people. Obviously, every job, every family counts here, but these are numbers that are relatively manageable within the scope of the full economy in Colorado. And on the power plant side, you can see here we've got the 7 power stations that are currently operating and running on coal. And you can see the planned closures of each of those units. And my guess is that this is going to accelerate. For instance, the Hayden station, I think, is going to close well before 2031. Craig is going to close in phases between now and 2030. et cetera, down the chart. But my guess is because of market and political factors, that probably gets accelerated even faster. But this at least gives you a sense of the number of jobs and sort of the scope of the problem, the size of the problem in Colorado that we're trying to grasp and make sure that we take care of these families, these workers, and of course the communities in which they're embedded. So that's the challenge. Supporting the Just Transition Office, we have set aside about $15 million in stimulus dollars. So state stimulus dollars that are going to be used for House Bill 1290. So that's really to get the program off the ground. And then a bill that I sponsored, 1312, adds another $5 million annually from severance taxes collected from coal producers. And so we've got a myriad of one-time and ongoing funds to really do this work at the state level. I would expect that there'll be additional federal dollars as well. And then we're partnering closely with local county commissions and city councils to really figure out how to spend this most effectively. And I think that's another important piece of how we're approaching this in Colorado. So we know what's coming. Really the big bill here that if folks want to take a look at is Senate Bill 19236, which I was a sponsor of. And it was lovingly referred to as the turducken because we combined three bills together. We had the Colorado Impact Assistance Act, which really started the conversation on just transition dollars and making sure that we have money available whenever a plant is closed. 1313 really accelerates the decarbonization of the electricity sector. And then we brought that all together in Senate Bill 236 so the PUC could do this work and do it with some policy tools, which is really what I want to focus on next. So we have a big set of new things in this 90-page bill, but I really want to focus in on authorizing the Public Utility Commission to financing orders to securitize the remaining capital value of these coal plants. And that, of course, is one of the biggest challenges for any state is what do you do with the stranded asset problem? You've got this coal plant that might be halfway through its life or less. And what do you do with all of that residual capital that is currently on the books for the regulated utility? And so sort of on the hook is the ratepayer of the state of Colorado. And that was one of the problems that we were trying to carefully manage in this process. So what does that look like? Well, even if the plant was built back in the 70s or 80s, you constantly have upgrades that are being done to those plants. Maybe a boiler upgrade, maybe you're adding pollution controls for SOx and NOx or particulates. Maybe it's an upgraded steam system and efficiency improvements. All of those things kind of refresh the capital balance sheet of a plant. And so even if the plant might be 40 years old, it still has a pretty sizable balance when it comes to remaining asset value. And that is sort of the stranded asset problem for the utility that must be confronted. And so securitization has been used for this many times. Kind of think of it as refinancing the mortgage. So Duke Energy in Florida, Consumers Energy in Michigan did sizable securitization offerings to try to handle the retirement of a nuclear plant, or in Michigan, it was the retirement of a coal plant, a 950 megawatt coal plant that was retired in 2016. And both of these were really advantageous for the ratepayers because they basically got to refinance the amount of stranded asset and spread that out over 20 or 30 years. And it becomes much more manageable for the ratepayer and drastically reduces the cost, which is what I'm going to focus on here in a second. So securitization has kind of taken off around the country. North Carolina, South Carolina looking at this. Kansas just passed securitization. Minnesota's looking at it. So a lot of new momentum around creating this tool in statute so that it can be used for things like plant retirements, or in some cases, storm costs or climate change impacts. Lots of different ways that these bonding tools can be used that are in the ratepayer's best interest. And that's really what we've created in Colorado with Senate Bill 236. So let's dig into the details here for a second. What is securitization? Well, if you're going to close a coal plant, you immediately get fuel and O&M savings, right? You turn the thing off and you don't have to buy coal and you don't have to maintain the plant anymore, but you still got this big amount of undepreciated capital cost, as I showed with that cash flow diagram just a few slides back. And you've got this option. What do you do with undepreciated capital cost? Well, you could just keep doing regular run-of-the-mill utility financing and just pay off a little bit of that mortgage every year, even after the plant's closed. Or you can turn that asset into and basically pay it off in one fell swoop with ratepayer-backed bonds. And it turns out ratepayer-backed bonds are way cheaper than using utility financing. And one of the big reasons for that is because you have substantially lower interest rate on that refi, typically around 2.5% versus regular utility financing, which is typically around 7.5% to 8%, depending on the utility. And so that generates a lot of savings for the ratepayer. Those savings can then be used to lower marginal cost of power across the system, pay for replacement of new generation assets that you'll need to replace that power. And of course, you're getting the benefit of lower fuel price risk because you're going to stop buying fuel. And so it doesn't matter if there's volatility in fuel prices. And then you can use those savings to create rate reductions for the customer. Or most importantly for this conversation, take some of those savings and use it for retraining and supporting workers and the communities in which they're located. And of course, many of the communities rely on property tax, and so you can use some of those savings to backfill in the short-term basis, the property tax from those big facilities. So lots of great opportunity here because you've generated so much savings. And of course, it's a much easier political conversation to talk about how do we share the savings pie as opposed to who gets charged more for an energy policy change. And I think that's one of the things that really makes this nonpartisan. This is just a spreadsheet exercise. We're going to save the customers money. We're going to generate funds that can be used to help the workers. And at the same time, we're going to lower the bills for all of the power customers across the state. So there's really a big win-win-win here. And if you're concerned about climate change and pollution, which I know everybody on this call is, that's kind of the fourth win. You also get, of course, massive environmental benefit from accelerating the closure of old fossil units. So here's kind of a comparison. Current asset, $55 a megawatt hour after you can't take into account depreciation. Some of the utilities like to argue for accelerated depreciation, which means pay it off quicker, but still use the high interest rates. That is a loser for ratepayers. So I would definitely encourage you not to do that. That is very much in favor of the IOU and doesn't help the ratepayer. And that's really where securitization comes in and creates a big win-win for both the ratepayer and for the environment and for the workers. So that's kind of a comparison between the three options on the table for most states. Securitization framework in Senate Bill 236. If you're having trouble sleeping some night, you want to look this up. Huge amount of detail that we put in statute to make sure that these bonding mechanisms work correctly and make sure that the ratepayer interests are carefully shepherded by the Public Utility Commission. So lots of clear direction in statute in Senate Bill 236, and here's some of the detail on that. I won't belabor that point this evening. Potential outcomes for Colorado. This is not a trivial exercise. This is real money. This is billions of dollars that are at stake, and there's a potential for billions of dollars of savings for the ratepayer. If we retired all the coal plants in the state and used securitization instead of utility financing, it would save somewhere between 1.4 and 1.7 billion dollars over the course of those bonds for the ratepayers. So a very material set of decisions that we are trying to drive with this legislation. To wrap up, some lessons learned. Framing is really important. I found that I got some agreement from my Republican colleagues because this is not a partisan exercise. It's not anti-coal. It's not anti-fossil fuels. It's just math. What makes the most sense for the ratepayers? How do we lower the cost of electricity while also making sure that we've got resources to help workers in transition? You need some balance. The utilities obviously have a big stake in this, and you have to balance their needs versus the consumer and make sure that it's tenable and politically viable in West Virginia. And I think the kind of starting point is that no one's going to get left behind. There's going to be resources available to help people transition, to help get retrained, whatever their needs are in that community. You need to really listen carefully, have a multi-year stakeholder engagement to make sure that the resources match the needs in the local community. And that's really what we were able to create, I think, with this legislation. So thank you so much for having me again. If you want to get in touch with me, here's my contact info. I'm pretty easy to find on the interwebs, but really enjoyed being able to present these ideas tonight. And with that, I'm going to stop and look forward to the discussion with Evan and Ann and everyone who's joined tonight.
Great, Chris. Thank you very much, Evan and Ann. I'll invite you to join us again with the video, and we'll move now to kind of our panel portion of this. Let me more formally introduce our two panelists. Professor Ann Eisenberg is an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law. She runs and started the Environmental Law Clinic, which involves law students tackling complex environmental litigation and projects on natural resources, environmental justice, and community economic development. Prior to being and joining on the faculty at South Carolina, she spent 2 years as a land use sustainable development law fellow at West Virginia University. So Ann, welcome. Our third panelist is Delegate Evan Hansen, who represents the 51st District in the West Virginia House of Delegates here in Morgantown. He's been working in West Virginia on the issue of just transitions. He also is president of Downstream Strategy, which is an environmental and economic development company using data-based analysis and plans to strengthen economies, work on more healthy environments, and build resilient community. We also are pleased to have him on the board here at the West Virginia Center on Climate Change. So Evan, welcome as well. And again, I would invite people participating and attending. You're most welcome. We're glad you're here. And also the Q&A is available to ask questions. Again, raising hands doesn't work in the format that we have set up for our webinar, so we would ask that you ask questions in the chat, in the Q&A box. So first we'll turn it over to our two panelists, Evan and do either of you have any comments that you'd like to make to Chris, or discuss it more in a national or in a West Virginia context, some of the information he's presented? I'll start with Ann.
Sure. Oh, I have so many questions. So I will try to limit myself. I'll confess my questions are a little self-interested in that I study rural community economic development and just transitions, sometimes wearing a practitioner hat, but more often as an academic. So it's great to hear from someone who's really on the front lines of crafting just transitions policy. So I think one of the things I've grappled with in my research is, have we done anything like this before as a society? So my question for you, Chris, is what precedents are you drawing on? I kind of have transitioning away from timber in the Pacific Northwest as one idea, transitioning away from tobacco farming as another. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on just historical precedents that are inspiring you.
Yeah, and this is such a great question. And I have to say, I introduced the first version of this back in 2017 in my first year in the House. And then I went over to the Senate in 2020. And there was not a lot of precedent, unfortunately. I mean, I would say, textiles, tobacco, kind of Rust Belt cities in the Midwest, right? We've got the timber industry, as you rightly point out. We have plenty of examples of rapid decline because of market forces and labor markets, et cetera, changing underneath people's feet. But historically, we've done a terrible job of this. And I think that was really what was top of my mind is I was reading the handwriting on the wall in 2017. It was clear we were going to be done with coal in the state of Colorado by the late 2020s. I mean, that is sort of in motion now and is irreversible. And we needed to be ready for that. So it was like, oh my gosh, we've got a very short amount of time to try to figure out this puzzle. And how do we, as I kind of joke, how do we skate to the puck? Like, how do we get to where we know we're going to need to be? And so I started racking my brain about how do we fund this? Because the state budget here, like most states, is very tight. I mean, we underfund schools, we underfund Medicaid, all the important things are already pinched very tightly. There's no excess general fund to suddenly come up with $50 million to address this. And that's really, the size of the need over the next few years is probably 50 to 60 million. And we needed some creative financing to get there. And so that's really where it started for me. Was I could see the problem was going to get really big, really fast. It was going to be hundreds of families per year for about 10 years. and I could see there was no money in the state budget. So it was like, okay, what other options do we have? And securitization really became a great tool in the toolkit. Of course, we've got some federal stimulus money now. We've got some state stimulus that was sort of unexpected that came out of COVID, and we've tried to take advantage of that for this moment. But long term, we needed steady funding, and I think that's where securitization is can really, really help.
I have a follow-up to that, and then I promise not to hog the conversation. I'll pass it over to Evan. If I recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Colorado Just Transition Plan in its text calls out the federal government for kind of a lack of adequate action. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on, speaking of this sort of lack of funding that so many states and localities are dealing with. If you could wave your magic wand, what would you want to see from the federal side?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we need a federal response that is up to this task across the country. And obviously we weren't going to sit and wait in Colorado for that to happen. Luckily now, Joe Manchin is the second most powerful person in the world. So you got it covered now in West Virginia. But no, all joking aside, we couldn't sit back and wait. We needed to take state action. But you're absolutely right. We feel like there has not been an adequate response from the federal government. I know there's now proposals in the Senate. I think Tammy Duckworth from Illinois came forward with a big proposal, and among others, to try to really meet this challenge at a national level. And we'd love to see that happen, because I think what we've done at the state is going to be great, but it's probably still not where we need to be across many of these transitions in fossil fuels. And so, I think it's still to be determined if the Senate's going to be able to move on that. But I think for states like West Virginia and other places that are heavily dependent on fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel power plants, this is going to happen quicker than we think, and I think the federal government needs to act.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann and Chris. Evan?
Yeah, let me give a little bit of context in West Virginia to compare with what you did in Colorado, and then I've also got questions. So as I think I modeled the bill after what you did in Colorado, a just transition bill that would have created a just transition office in West Virginia and resulted in drafting a just transition plan. The bill actually passed the House of Delegates in the 2020 session, but didn't get taken up by the state Senate. So in the last session in 2021, we kind of rebranded it. The phrase just transition started to get a little tarnished by some of the interest groups. So we called it the Coal Community Comeback Plan bill. We're trying to focus on coal communities, because that's really what this is about. And we actually had a very full debate about it in the House of Delegates. And despite the strong objections of the Coal Association, it passed 50-49. It was a bipartisan vote, passed the House. Unfortunately, when it went to the Senate on the last day of the session, they refused to allow it in their bill. We had amended it into the bill that the Coal Association was shepherding through the House. So they sent it back to us, and on the last night of the session, it was removed. So while it didn't pass into state code, what we did get was a substitute, which is the Speaker of the House created what he called the Coal Community Work Group. And it's a bipartisan group of delegates that are now working throughout the state to facilitate discussions in coal communities about what they need and what they want to see in order to diversify economies and bring jobs and opportunities into these places that are being hit so hard. So for the people on the call or on the Zoom who are from West Virginia, be on the lookout for these opportunities to participate in these listening sessions that will take place in September and October this year. But one question I had for you is that, I've had a lot of discussions with policymakers and heads of utilities and others with an interest in these issues. And I think, although a lot of people are not acknowledging it publicly, privately, it's acknowledged that the coal-fired power plants in West Virginia are shutting down. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Are they going to shut down in the 2020s, or are they going to shut down in the 2030s? That's really where the debate is now. And one of the reasons why they don't seem to be wanting to move quicker, despite the sort of economics that you presented in your slides, is because coal-fired power plants, they generate baseload power. And they get paid in two ways. They get paid for the electricity they generate, but they also get paid by sitting idle and providing capacity. And it's that capacity market that seems to tip the scales and arguably, according to some, makes it economical to keep these plants open, even if they're not generating much power. So I guess my question for you is have you had a similar issue related to baseload power and what coal-fired power plants produce in Colorado, and how did you address that issue?
Yeah, thanks, Delegate Hansen. We had very similar arguments made here about sort of the need for spinning reserve, capacity, reliability questions around closing these plants. I think the interesting thing to note is that this concept of baseload power, I think, is going to kind of disappear over the next 10 years in grid parlance, because it's starting to become meaningless in the way that we're managing the grid. I think there's a separate bill I did this year was on RTOs, regional transmission organizations. Colorado has historically not been in one. And one of the ways you get rid of the need for lots of backup and baseload is you band together with your neighbors and share electricity resources. And Colorado has not been very good at that historically, something that the eastern part of the US has done a lot more of, with PJM and MISO and SPP as examples. And so that was I think, kind of top of mind as we discuss this. The other thing I would say is that solar projects now in Colorado of any size, all the utility scale ones, are all including some storage to come with them. And so you're now in the position where you can take that sun from 5 p.m. and use it at 8 o'clock in a way that we never have before. And so you're getting through the evening peak. And so the need for all that extra capacity is really starting to drop off as we do more storage projects. The other thing we have that I'm not sure about in West Virginia is a lot of pump storage. We've got some large pump storage facilities, 700 megawatts in one case. And so we've got some great physical storage, not batteries, but kind of the natural battery of pump storage that helps us to obviate the need for those capacity backups from coal plants. So not to say it's an easy situation, right? There's engineering challenges we have to figure out. But as those coal plants close, I think we are in a very good spot to not see any drop off in reliability. And that concept of baseload power, I think, is going to get less important over time.
Maybe I'll ask one more, if that's okay, before we get to the other questions. And it has to do with securitization. So you are right that we do have securitization in state code in West Virginia, but we're not allowed to use it according to current state code for the use that you're talking about. So there is a bill that we're in the process of drafting that would expand the use of securitization to deal with the remaining capital value of coal-fired power plants should they close. And I think that's going to be an important tool. Have you found that the utilities have made use of that tool now that it's allowed?
Yeah, well, Evan, great question. Not yet is the answer. The biggest utility in Colorado is a company called Xcel. They've got operations in 5 or 6 states, and Colorado's about half of their portfolio, roughly. They have now proposed it for a future use later in 2020s to close down the biggest plant in the state called Comanche 3. So they are looking at it. I think, the utilities, of course, are acting in their best fiduciary interest of their shareholders. And so they are reluctant to use securitization really unless they're forced to, in a way, or they have to, in Colorado code, what we've done is basically force them to show the math. Like, is their proposal for retirement better for the ratepayer than using securitization? So that's what we've set up right now. We're not requiring that they use it, but they have to show that whatever they propose is going to be at least as good for the ratepayer as securitization. And I'm really happy with that setup because I don't think there is a better option for ratepayers. It will come out ahead, I think, in basically every scenario, particularly because the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital for Xcel, is about 7%. And right now, of course, they can securitize at about 2.3% with AAA rated commercial bonds. So there's a huge reduction in costs for the ratepayer, and more than enough to, those savings to do all the things we talked about in the presentation. So it's not required, but I think we're going to see a lot more of it over the next 5 or 6 years.
Great. Let me bring in our audience. We have a couple of questions. The first two I'm going to just pretty much direct towards you, Chris, because they're questions about Colorado. One is talking about wind power, and it very well may apply to solar power as well. As the price of the megawatts are going down, it becomes something of a seller's market for the wind turbine installers. Are you finding that you're losing some of this money with the wind turbine installers increasing the price of putting in the wind turbines, and comparable question for solar?
Yeah, well, the good news is that is really a global market now. So there's very little pricing power for an individual turbine supplier. Colorado is fortunate that we have a pretty large Vestas manufacturing hub here, but they are in very tough competition with the other big turbine manufacturers. And so Siemens and GE and et cetera are all fighting it out with the responses to the RFPs. And what we found is that prices for wind continue to drop. They were $23, $24 in the last round. They're now under $20, and we think they're going to be as low as $16 or $17 in the next round of bids per megawatt hour on a levelized basis. And so no pricing power really there for the sellers. And so I think we'll just see the benefits continue to accrue to the customer in lower and lower prices for wind projects. And the same is happening on solar. Solar panels continue to drop in price, hugely competitive global market for that. And the same thing's happening with batteries. And so I was mentioning solar and batteries now being co-installed in almost every case for Colorado projects. They can share inverters for those projects, and so it lowers the total capital cost over the life of the project. So lots of great economies of scale there for wind, solar, and batteries, and Colorado customers are really reaping the benefit.
And another Colorado specific question: is your pump storage from pumped hydro? And has that become an environmental concern, or has there been a pushback from any interest groups on that?
Yeah, really wonderful question. So I think it's highly unlikely we'll build any new pumped hydro for the environmental concerns that you mentioned. It's very difficult to get permits on any new facilities, but we had a facility that was built before World War II that we have expanded and added some capacity to. It's now about 700 megawatts, as I mentioned. It's called Cabin Creek. It's just west of Denver, up in the mountains. And so that has been a powerful tool for managing the grid and keeping costs low as we integrate more and more renewables into the system. So I think that's exactly right. There's probably not going to be any new ones, even though we've got plenty of mountains. It's almost impossible to flood a new valley, as it were. But we do have some existing assets that are going to be very valuable.
Great, thank you. And this I'll throw out to all of our panelists, and Anne mentioned it, and I think Chris was also talking about it a little bit. We just had the Senate passing the infrastructure bill, which tends to be a more traditional infrastructure type of plan, but there are some climate change plans. What's missing from the infrastructure plan that may or may not be in the reconciliation plan that will be passed that you think is essential for climate activity and to assure that we're not leaving behind anybody in this transition? So that's really to all of you.
Anne, you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm as I was mentioning before we got started, I'm afraid I'm still playing catch up on some of the federal activities these days. One concern I wanted to flag for my co-panelists that I think relates to the question, but I'll shoehorn my question here too. I'm worried about local governments. And so we're thinking about, there's so many pieces to this question, and we've talked about jobs and livelihoods and how those numbers in absolute terms might not necessarily be huge, definitely significant and mattering, but not huge. And then we've talked about ratepayers. And I'm curious both whether the federal packages that we're focused on right now had enough support for local governments. My guess would be not. And whether I'm correct in my sense that the risks to local kind of tax coffers and local budgets are maybe kind of lurking as a more more serious, a lot of attention gets focused on jobs and livelihoods, as it should. But I'm wondering if I'm correct in my sense that this sort of regional tax base and the functioning of local government, and all the things that local governments do that we take for granted. I guess the question I'm raising related to the question is, was there support in those bills for local governments? And do you guys agree that that is kind of a big issue here that doesn't get quite enough attention?
And I appreciate you framing it in that term, because my next question was going to be, how does the local government respond to it? So Evan, Chris, if you have any input from West Virginia or Colorado on those kind of dual issues, what does the federal still need to do? What does state and local still need to do? What are some of the risks for local?
Evan, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of local investments, there's a ton of money coming into cities and counties and states that's still unallocated from the American Rescue Plan. I mean, there's so much coming into local communities around here that they're not sure what to do with the money. They're having public input sessions to try to get feedback from community members, which is actually a good thing to do. And this money is coming into communities that are impacted by this transition and communities that aren't. And so I think at least for the next 6 months to a year or two, there's a lot of money to be spent that is going to help create a lot of jobs, and if spent wisely, diversify economies that could create long-term benefits as well. So that's good.
I think Evan's spot on as far as the short-term federal help, and a bunch of that is going straight to localities, as well as some state programs. But what I would say is that it's only a year or two, maybe three, that's going to be around. And I think there's a longer-term question here. I mean, to give you a practical example, in Craig, Colorado, and the Craig station shuts down, it is the single largest taxpayer in that county by far. It is 50% of the school district's budget. It is 50% of the town's budget. And suddenly that's gone. And of course, there's a multiplier effect if those jobs aren't replaced. And so, I think we're trying to look really hard at how do you replace property values in the local tax base as we think about these transition projects. And so we are trying to talk and listen carefully to the county commissioners, to the city council, to the mayors, to local economic development agencies, and what new assets can we bring into that community. So for instance, for the Craig Power Station, we've got this big transmission asset, one of the best in the country. It can handle a huge amount of power transfer, 1,200 to 1,400 megawatt at a time. Can we put a hydrogen storage facility on that site? Can we start thinking about more grid scale storage at the same site as the power station when it closes down, to take advantage of that asset and immediately put capital back into the property tax base? So I think that's the long-term puzzle that we've got to figure out. And it's something we tried to confront head on with the just transition work, is that the money that's generated from a securitization proposal can be used to backfill lost property tax. Now, it can't go on forever. It might be 5 years of backfill to try to bridge from point A to point B, but that is explicitly in the bill, and it's front of mind for the state and local just transition plans.
Great. Evan, let me ask you a question now about West Virginia. We saw Chris's presentation, which indicated, of course, there's every family counts, every family needs to be taken care of, but as he stated, it's a relatively small number. West Virginia, have we done a count of how many employees there are in the coal industry, how many people may be affected, how much just transitions and is going to cost and be involved in West Virginia?
Yes. So the worst case scenario, which is not going to happen, would be if every coal miner and power plant worker lost their job. But that's like by far the worst case scenario. And so there's about 15,000 coal miners and power plant workers that are directly employed in those industries in West Virginia. But there's a few reasons why that's not going to happen. One is that even though there's going to be less and less coal burned to generate electricity, there's still going to be coal-fired power plants in West Virginia, at least through the 2020s and 2030s or so, like I said before. And secondly, there's other types of coal, other uses of coal. There's met coal that's used to create steel, and there's no viable alternative that I'm aware of right now to met coal. So met coal is a very valuable commodity, and it's going to continue to be mined in West Virginia, at least for the foreseeable future. And then there's a burgeoning research and industry that's building up now to use coal as a manufacturing input to make advanced carbon products. So it has nothing to do with burning the coal, it has to do with using it as an input into manufacturing. And there's a lot of federal money going into these research projects and a lot of private capital being invested as well. And so that could also extend the life of many of these coal mines and extend the job prospects for a lot of coal miners for those uses of coal. And then further, we're starting to look at what Chris mentioned about what do you do with these coal-fired power plant sites after they retire. And the bill that I mentioned that we're drafting that would expand securitization in West Virginia also has a section that addresses what would be preferable to do with these former coal-fired power plant sites. And the types of developments that the senator mentioned are also the types of developments that we're looking at here in West Virginia for the same reasons. We could transfer a workforce potentially. Those sites are already connected to the grid and can make use of those connections to have a more efficient site for other types of power production. And there's other reasons as well. So there may be some ways to transition workers from one industry to another industry where those industries have very similar skill sets.
I appreciate the way you ended that question, because it kind of leads nicely to the next question from our participants. One of the comments that's been made about these plans to find new jobs or invest in our coal families is that the pay scale of a new job is not as high. I think there was some mention of the old forestry programs in the Northwest where you're getting retrained for a job that doesn't exist. So my question to Chris is, how are you addressing that question of finding comparable jobs, and more broadly to Anne as a policy issue and an environmental justice issue and a human justice issue? How do we assure that this kind of just transition is economically beneficial to the individuals, and Evan, of course, the West Virginia perspective? But I'll start with Chris on that question from the Colorado experience and any pushback that you've gotten from labor.
Yeah, well, the bills that I described here were very carefully negotiated with IBEW and the other labor unions for exactly this reason. And I guess what I would mention is that it's the scale of the problem is maybe a bit more manageable than it seems at first blush, because if you think about, again, the Craig station and that I've been using as an example, it's about 150 employees right now. They plan to close in 6, 7, 8 years, different phases. And that means that you have a certain amount of natural attrition that is going to happen to that workforce. So about 45 of those 150, 55 or so, up to 55 are going to retire between now and the end of the life of the plant. So about a third of the problem is, in a sense, going to be taken care of because of retirement or early retirement. Then there's about a third of the workers who are going to transfer to other comparable jobs within the operating companies that own those plants. So Tri-State and Excel are the two utilities, and they have other jobs that are going to be available throughout the rest of their portfolio. And so that helps to replace those lost jobs. And then you have kind of roughly about a third of the jobs that will be lost when that gets shut down. And I think that's really the one of the reasons we want to look at things like hydrogen or ammonia production or storage projects, where you could replace the vast majority of those 1/3 of remaining jobs that you don't have a solution for on site, in place, at a very similar pay scale. And so I think that's really the way to think about the problem. It's kind of one bite at a time of the elephant. and we've got different workers in different situations, and we need to have a set of resources and solutions that are going to be flexible. And that's what we're trying to create in Western Colorado right now.
Great. And if you could give us kind of the perspective from your research on this question.
Yeah, so I think I would actually add another wrinkle to the problem, which is that in the energy sector, altogether, so both in terms of traditional fossil fuel jobs and in terms of sort of the new-ish green jobs, that white men are pretty dramatically overrepresented in both. So I wanted to inject that as a consideration. We're talking about climate change, we're talking about just transitions. Can also bring in sort of the racial justice conversation that's happening now as well. And just note that maybe that problematizes an approach that's just sort of a one-to-one matching of job to job, given the sort of historic inequities there. And that also raises sort of a broader kind of intersection here with environmental justice too, as something that we haven't quite touched on yet, but as something that is relevant. So I will just offer those 2 cents.
Great. Evan, anything from the West Virginia perspective?
Yeah, what I wanted to add is that, I'm a strong supporter of bringing as many jobs as possible from the renewable energy industry into West Virginia. But I think there's a fallacy that needs to be sort of exposed, which is the fallacy being that the transition needs to be from fossil energy jobs to renewable energy jobs. And I don't think that's the case. I think if you think about what the challenge has been in West Virginia, we're losing more population than any state in the country. And we're not a state that people want to live in and want to be an entrepreneur in and grow jobs in. And to the extent that we allow the renewable industry to thrive and have some type of a transition, that's going to diversify our economy in all different ways and create all different types of jobs. Some will be low-paying jobs, some will be very high-paying jobs. We'll have types of jobs in parts of the state that have never had those opportunities before. And so I think what I would suggest is we think about this transition not as sort of the end of where we're going to, but just sort of like a pathway toward the future, which will then provide a wide variety of higher paying jobs. That's what we're really looking for.
Great. I've got a quick question for Chris and Evan. This is pretty much a yes or no question, and I think Evan kind of got at it with just expanding the economic base and the population base, but are either Colorado or West Virginia considering basically just a wage replacement kind of payment as a just transition, or is it more organic, more comprehensive kind of economic transition?
Well, I'd say for Colorado's case, I think we are, but a very limited sense. I think that would be a tool that'd be available for a short-term period, and we're getting feedback from the operating companies and the local governments on that. One of the things we're requiring the utilities to do is have a very clear labor transition plan. And so, I was sketching out 150 employees, about a third will retire, about a third will get transferred, and about a third we're going to have to work on a number of different options. But that's part of what the utilities got to bring to the table when they announce a closure, and then we sort of go from there. And so it's not to say some short-term wage replacement payments wouldn't be possible, but I think it's going to be a very minor portion of what we do in Colorado.
And I'm definitely open to it. I understand the argument for it. It was not in the bill that I had introduced. And I would like to see the federal government step up and make that part of the federal approach to this problem.
Any other states, Anne, addressing that issue of more direct kind of payments or one-for-one payments that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Great. All right. Well, we've kind of reached the point where we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. And what I like to do at this point, we got to just about everybody's question on the from the audience. The couple that I couldn't get to, I'm sorry, but we do have our respect to you all to get you all done and out of here by about 8 or as close to it as possible. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask each of the panelists, now having had this conversation and heard this discussion, to just kind of give us your takeaway, the point you want to emphasize, the point you haven't said that you think is important. And I'd ask you to do about a minute each. We'll start with Evan and then go to Ann, and then I'll let the senator have the last word. So Evan, what's the takeaway?
Well, I appreciate your presentation, Senator. It shows what can be done. You know, you're a few years ahead of where we are here in West Virginia, so it's nice to have models like that where we can model legislation based on what you've done and also learn from how that legislation has panned out after it's been passed. So we appreciate all your work on that and the lessons that it provides. Thanks.
Thank you, Evan. Ann?
Yeah, so it's very much a privilege for me to be on a panel with these two, and it's making me reflect about sort of being an academic versus being someone in a policymaking position, and how Chris and Evan have to deal with everyday realities, and I can think big pie in the sky thoughts. And so my closing reflection would just be sort of a question for the room is this an opportunity for, is what we're doing here attempting a full restructuring of our economy and our society, ultimately piece by piece, locality by locality, state by state, hopefully eventually with more federal support. That's just what I'm thinking about here, but I've really appreciated the conversation and hearing about folks' experiences. So thank you, Chris and Evan.
Great. Thank you, Ann. I appreciate the comments and all the comments you've made. Chris, you've got the floor for the final word.
All right. Well, I'll just wrap up on the thought that we are running out of time. Climate change is a clear and present danger. It is affecting our lives today, and it's going to accelerate and get worse. And the IPCC report that came out yesterday, it says we have even less time than we thought. So we need urgent action. We need every state, we need every country, we need every household to take action right now. And I hope, there's a few things we've done in Colorado that might be useful in other places. I love this conversation tonight about some financial tools that, really are about saving customers money. And oh, by the way, we can decarbonize as we do it. And when I'm talking to my Republican friends, that's what I talked about. It's like, it's cheaper for your constituents if we do this now and don't wait. When I'm talking to my constituents in Denver, I talk a lot about how we need urgent climate action, and they're pleasantly surprised that their bills can go down at the same time. So, know your audience, but let's not shy away from the fact that the clock is ticking. And if we would like to continue to live on this planet, we need to act right now to decarbonize. And it's hard, it's difficult conversations. And I'm, can only imagine what that is like in West Virginia. But we can't shy away from those because, our kids are counting on us right now.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank both of our panelists, Evan Hansen and Ann Eisenberg, for giving us their time and their very thoughtful comments. Special thank you to Senator Chris Hansen for joining us today to give us some updates on what Colorado's doing and some of the good work that's out there. Also, we mainly would like to thank the people that attended and participated. We appreciate your support of this presentation. Again, this is the second of the third series that we're doing. It's sponsored by the West Virginia Center on Climate Change, the West Virginia College of Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, and the West Virginia Climate Alliance. Our third and final presentation of this series will be on September 14th. Our first presentation was kind of a federal policy perspective. This presentation today was a perspective of state and to some extent local considerations and policy We're pleased to announce that our speaker on September 14th will be West Virginia University Professor of Geography, Jamie Shin, who will be talking about some of the community groups and some of the local groups that are involved in these kind of community and economic development. We'll be sending out the invite emails very soon to that, and I hope that everybody can join. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Senator Hansen, and thank all of you all for attending tonight. And everybody have a great evening, and hopefully we'll see you all back on September 14th. Thank you.